Welcome to the lecture for ATS 113 about climate controls and climate classification. This is Dr. John Troggy, copyright 2005. Today we're going to be talking about the kind of factors that control the climate of a region, how we determine what kind of climate the region has, and the different types of climates on the world. I want to reemphasize a point that we learned back in the third unit of the course, and that is that climate is the average of the day-to-day weather over some long period of time, typically about 30 years. So climate is fundamentally about statistics. What is the average temperature on November 15th in Omaha? Or what is the average amount of rain in July in Des Moines? This is in contrast to general circulation, which was about what is the atmosphere doing and why. Climate is fundamentally just about statistics. It's about describing the climate, not explaining why the climate is that way. A lot of times meteorologists think of climate as being less interesting than your day-to-day weather, but actually it's more important in the long run. Climate determines where people can live, it determines what kind of foods they can grow and what kind of foods they can eat. It determines the kind of shelter or housing that people can live in. It determines the kind of clothes our culture can allow, and so on. Culture can survive day-to-day weather, but over the great period of time, the climate is ultimately going to be determining the basics of whether or not humans can survive in a given region. Several civilizations through human history have flourished when their climates were favorable, but then they disappeared when their climates became less favorable. For example, Egypt. In the early periods of Egypt's history, we're talking like 3,000-4,000 BC, much of Egypt was actually a grassland, but climate changed over a period of a few thousand years and became much more dry. If you're wondering how they were able to build such amazing monuments in a desert, well, it wasn't quite so desert when the Egyptians were building that kind of stuff. They had the ability to raise crops that were able to support a population. Another classic example of a civilization that failed when its climate changed are the Mayans in southern Mexico and northern parts of Central America. The Mayans were a very successful civilization around the years 800, 900 AD, but they failed when their climate changed and became more dry. Their crops failed, their sources of water dried up, and as a consequence the civilization collapsed in a fairly short period of time. Vikings are another example of a civilization that failed. Vikings existed primarily by using a specialized type of ship to sail up the rivers of northern Europe, where they would raid and plunder villages. That was how their civilization worked. But during the Little Ice Age, which happened in the Middle Ages and in northern Europe, most of the rivers in northern Europe remained frozen. If you're a civilization that is based on sailing ships upriver and the rivers are frozen, your culture dies out. A more obscure example are the Khmer. This was a civilization in Cambodia that disappeared a few hundred years ago when its climate changed and could no longer support the crops the people there lived on. Climate is a surprisingly difficult property to quantify. It's very difficult to narrow down what's causing, what exactly is the climate of a given region. Let me give you an example. Think about the kind of instrument shelters that we use to measure the temperatures at a weather service office. They measure the temperature a few meters above the ground, in the shade, in a well-ventilated box, and that gives a very different temperature reading than even a few meters away near the ground. This would be an example of what we call microclimate. Microclimates are climates over very small domains. Like, for example, in this picture, clearly the climate near this rock is somewhat warmer than the climate away from the rock. The rock is giving off long-wave radiation that melts the snow. Clearly the temperature near the rock is greater than the temperature away from the rock. Microclimate then tends to be the climate over very small regions. For example, here in this a good example of microclimates are vineyards. Vineyards are typically on the slopes of mountains that face the sunny side of whatever the sunny side of the mountain is. That's where grapes are grown to make wine. Typically the shady side of the mountain is a few degrees cooler, and as a consequence they can't grow grapes on that side. It's a microclimate. Mesoclimate is a climate over a somewhat larger domain. Meso usually meaning medium-sized. This is typically over the area of a few miles. This is maybe the climate over a forest, over a large city, the climate over mountains maybe. The difference from the climate near the shore versus a little bit away from the shore. In this example here, I've shown you an example of the mesoclimate of Las Vegas, where inside of the city it's fairly moist, but clearly as you look out in the distance, it's obviously a desert. Mesoclimate could also describe the climate of a state. This is a map of the precipitation in an average year this is the climatology of precipitation for Nebraska. And you can see that, for example, southwest Nebraska gets more rain, southeast Nebraska gets more rain, northwest Nebraska gets very little. This is a climate over an area maybe about the size of a state. This is an example of mesoclimate. Macroclimate would be the climate over a much larger area of like multiple states or countries. For example, in this picture, which depicts the vegetation over the United States, you can clearly see that the east is much drier. The east is much more moist than the west, except for California. You can see that the northwest is quite moist. These are climates over fairly large regions, macroclimate. And today's lecture is going to principally be about macroclimate and the kind of factors that control macroclimate. And of course, these macroclimatic regions are quite extensive. Think how large a desert is, or how large a jungle is, or how large a northern forest is. These cover large chunks of the world, and as a consequence, they are macroclimate. We can ask ourselves then, what kind of factors control the climate? What determines what climate you get at what region? And I'm going to tell you today that there's going to be a total of 7 climate controls, 7 different factors that influence the temperature and precipitation that a region experiences. Our first climate control is called intensity of sunshine. This is all about sun angles, as we learned in the first unit of the course. Now, this little diagram here just illustrates how the sun angles change at 2 different locations. In this case, it's San Antonio, which is down in Texas, and Winnipeg, which is up in Canada. We, of course, learned in the first unit of the course that sun angles are quite low in the northern latitudes and quite high in the southern latitudes, which helped explain why it's warm in the south and cool in the north. And so that's pretty self-evident. However, I also want to illustrate the fact that as you go farther north, not only is it cooler, but there is a greater range in the temperatures over the course of the year. For example, let's compare 2 cities in the United States, Miami and New York. Miami, in the summer, is a very mild, temperate place. It's temperatures maybe in the 80s or something like that. But that also seems to describe the temperatures in New York in the summer. In New York in the summer, the temperatures are probably on average a little cooler than the temperatures in Miami. On the other hand, it's still quite warm, quite temperate of a climate. Winter in Miami, on the other hand, has temperatures very similar to summer in Miami. Average temperatures in Miami in the winter maybe are in the 60s or 70s, still quite mild, still quite nice. But that is not what we would say about winter in New York. Winter in New York is quite severe. It's true that the overall temperature in New York is cooler than the temperature in Miami, but more importantly, the range of temperatures are different. In Miami, there's very little difference between winter and summer. In New York, there's a great deal of difference between winter and summer. The intensity of sunlight, or the latitude of the location, is our most important climate control. Our second most important climate control, on the other hand, is the distribution of land and water. Only latitude is a more important climate control factor than this. Due to the high heat capacity of water, maritime climates are very mild for their latitude. If you're near the ocean, you have a much milder climate than an inland or continental location. Continental climates are very extreme for their latitude. They have a great range. It's very hot in the summer and it's very cold in the winter. To illustrate the difference between a marine climate and a continental climate, let's pick 2 cities that are at the same latitude and compare their climates. How about Seattle and Fargo? Now, Seattle is right near the Pacific Ocean. It's going to have a very marine